Hello, three students. Here for a second video for this week. This one about Aristotle. We've read a little bit of Aristotle's The Politics. To give you a little bit of a rundown here on what Aristotle's philosophy and thinking as we see in the Politics, but also in a little bit of context, a little larger discussion about Aristotle in general. So the important thing to note here is that Aristotle is a student of Plato, or was a student of Plato, and Aristotle and Plato left on not great terms. So, Plato set up this academy in Athens to teach people the sort of philosophical way of life, and Aristotle was his preeminent pupil, and Plato dies, and someone else has to take over the academy, and Plato, as his last act, picks someone else, and Aristotle is quite bitter about that, and basically, even though Plato's not dead, Aristotle has major beef with Plato, and so some of what we see here in the Politics is, I'm very mad at Plato, and I'm going to tell you everything I think is wrong with what Plato taught. And so we get some major points of disagreement between Plato and Aristotle here in the Politics, and that disagreement will become even more clear once we read more selections of the Republic later on in this term. The biggest criticism that Aristotle has of Plato is this idea of philosopher kings, right? The idea that philosophers should rule because philosophers know the good, the true, and the beautiful, what we talked a little bit about with the allegory in the cave. Aristotle thinks that's just nonsense. For Aristotle, there's a distinction. There's two types of knowledge. There's what Aristotle calls theoretical knowledge, and then there's practical knowledge or practical reason. Theoretical knowledge is knowledge of what is true and universal, right? So the idea of the forms, right, the perfection that exists out there, right? You can, if you study hard enough and you learn and become a very good, virtuous individual, you can learn the good, the true, and the beautiful, right? That's theoretical knowledge, Aristotle says. Practical knowledge is the knowledge of human affairs. Knowledge of human affairs, right? Who humans are, how humans act, and you learn that based upon practice, right? You live in society, you study people, you see people, you live your life, you gain practical wisdom from living in society. Someone is a good judge because he's likely to be correct in his assessments, but you aren't just correct in your assessments because you study hard enough. You're correct in your assessments because you've lived and you've picked up some practical knowledge along the way. Aristotle says that's the kind of knowledge you need to govern society. We need people with practical wisdom, people who understand society and understand citizens. Theoretical knowledge is useless. What good is it to know the good? So you know the good. Great. Now how are you going to implement it? Think about tennis. I can sit in front of my TV and I can watch the Williams sisters play tennis all day long. I still suck at tennis. Right? I can sit and study tennis over and over again. I'm not going to get good at it by sitting and studying at it, Aristotle thinks. The only way you can get good at tennis is to get out and practice. Right? So that's the difference between, say, theoretical knowledge and practical knowledge. Plato says, if you just study hard enough, you just learn it. Through studying or through contemplation, you'll be good at it. Aristotle says that's nonsense. You can't do that, right? So that's really, really important. So the prime qualification for political leadership, according to Aristotle, is not theoretical knowledge, but practical knowledge. Right? Someone who knows, is a good judge because of their practical knowledge, their practical wisdom. And so that brings us to book 1 and book 2 of Politics here by Aristotle, where we sort of get an outline of society. For Aristotle, the polis, that's the term he uses, the political society, the political community, is natural. It's not the product of convention or some social contract, but it is a natural occurrence. The individual is not self-sufficient. The individual needs others. So because of that, the individual starts a family. But the family is also not self-sufficient. Sure, maybe dad can is a good welder, or dad is a good shoemaker, but we need food. So we need other people who can farm, and we need people who can make baskets, and we need people who can make pottery, and we need people who can cook, and we need other people, right? And so while the family can achieve a limited sense of self-sufficiency, it requires help from other families. And so families combine together to form a village, and the villages ultimately become our political community. And you are always born into a political community. You are never born outside of a political community. You are never born in isolation. You are born amongst other people, which is why we need to have a well-ordered society, because society will ultimately shape you. Right? The society you are born in, its values and what it promotes will ultimately determine who you are. And because of that, we need to have laws that are oriented towards a common good and a common purpose. If we can do that, people within our society will also be oriented towards a common good and a common purpose, because the laws teach us how to act. Right? One of the purposes of laws are not just about deterrence, but they're also about character building and virtue building and morality building. Right? We have laws against murder, not just to dissuade people from murdering people, but also because we think murder is bad. Right? That you should not murder people because it is wrong to murder people. Not just we hope you don't murder people because we want to deter you from murdering them. Right? Yeah, deterrence is there, but we want to teach you that this is wrong. So laws are a teaching tool for Aristotle. So how do we get laws that orient us towards the common good? Well, people need to take into consideration the needs and concerns of others. And the way we do that is through political life. We come and we gather and we speak and we meet and we talk and we debate. Political life is important towards achieving the good, because political life and political community helps keep people on the straight and narrow path. Confucius is slightly different from Aristotle, but Confucius says that we should take the bent stick and straighten it out. Aristotle has a very similar idea. Anyone who acts out or acts in a way that is not in accordance with the virtues and values of the community should be nurtured and taught by the community about the right way to act. And so, the idea here is that a rising tide raises all ships. If someone is bereft of goodness and virtue, that society can lift that person up. But society can only do that if our laws are oriented towards goodness and a common good. Right? And Aristotle says that this is all natural. Right? Man is a political animal, and that man is a social animal. Now, why does Aristotle say that? And is he right? Do we agree? I think are important questions. But the individual is the only person that, people are we're the only animal that can conceive of right and wrong, goodness and truth, bad and evil, and we can articulate that. And that's what our political debates are about. Right and wrong, good and bad, best course of action, wrong course of action. We're the only animal that can have those discussions and beliefs. And that's what makes us political. Politics is a debate over what the right course of action is. For Aristotle, what matters is what's something known as teleology, or telos, T-E-L-O-S. This is Greek ancient Greek for purpose. Right? Society has a purpose, and each of us have a purpose, and we are supposed to achieve that purpose, that end goal. Right? So we can determine goodness and badness, justice and injustice based upon the purpose or function of an institution. if the purpose of an institution is to achieve happiness, then we can determine the goodness or justness of that institution as to whether, based upon whether or not it achieves its purpose or its end goal, right? And so, for humans, right, our political society is oriented towards the common good of all. And so we can evaluate the justness of society, the goodness of the actions of society as to whether or not it achieves that end goal, that purpose. So for Aristotle, everything starts from the purpose and then works its way out. The purpose of basket making is to make good baskets. So we can determine the goodness of basket makers based on how well they make their baskets, right? The purpose of law is to make sure people act in a just and virtuous manner, and we can determine whether or not laws are fulfilling their purpose by looking at the people that live within society. And if we are not achieving our purpose, right, if we are not oriented towards the good, then we need to change the rules that society is using to govern ourselves, right? And so, if we think about what Aristotle is saying here, it really conflicts with our modern emphasis on individual freedoms, right? We live in a liberal society. Now, by liberal, I don't mean, say, democratic or leftist politics. What I mean is a society that embraces individual rights and individual freedoms. For us, the common good of society is second to our individual rights, where you have the right to freedom of speech and freedom of religion and freedom of expression, and you may freely express those things, even if they are contrary to, say, a common good. Because we value we put a heavy emphasis on the freedom of the individual. For Aristotle, it's a collective society, right? Your ability to do something ends where it butts up against the common good and purpose of society. And so that's something to think about here with Aristotle, is that there may be a conflict here between what Aristotle sees as the purpose of politics and the purpose of political community, and what we see as the purpose of political community. Okay? Something else I want you to think about here is how Aristotle talks about slaves and women. Aristotle says the political community is a community of equals, and if people aren't equal to other people, then they don't get to participate, and he singles out women and slaves. Why does he do that? And is this deeply problematic for Aristotle's theory about politics? Does it detract from his overall theory? Does it make you think less of his overall theory? I think that's a legitimate question. Why is he defending slavery? Why is he defending the subjugation of women to men? These are important questions, important things to look for here in Aristotle's Politics. And I think it's reasonable to criticize Aristotle for being unable to step outside of his time. And basically, he's defending sort of status quo. He's defending the inferiority of women and defending slavery, which is unlike Plato. We may see this in the Republic later, but Plato puts men and women on equal footing and basically says slavery is unconscionable. So another difference there between Plato and Aristotle. Plato thought anyone could have a conception of the good and learn the good and practice philosophy. Aristotle thinks that only certain people can acquire practical wisdom and theoretical wisdom, and that women and people who are slaves are incapable of doing that. So just something to think about there with Aristotle. So that's Aristotle's Politics in a very brief nutshell. Obviously, that's not everything, but those are